The spells of Far Far West are a vital part of any loadout, and the spell roster you take with you can easily make or break your missions. Your spells can be used in pretty much every aspect of combat, from horde clearing and burst damage, to even survivability and mobility. Many spells can also be combined with each other and other elemental effects to create larger, more impactful casts, letting you do some very cool things. Despite their strengths, spells have one major flaw: cooldowns. Every spell has a cooldown after use, with some short ones only lasting for 10 seconds, while many others last upwards of 2 minutes. These cooldowns exist to encourage the player to, use their gun, but that didn't stop me from trying to use almost exclusively spell damage to clear every difficulty in the game. But before we start, if you haven't already, consider subscribing. It's a great way to support the channel and helps me to keep making the content you enjoy. With that out of the way though, let's get ready to cast some spells. For each difficulty, I wanted to run a different set of spells. Some spells are unfortunately notably worse than others, but I still wanted to give them their moment in the spotlight on some of the easier difficulties before conforming to the meta too closely. For normal mode, I decided to run Bubble, Surcharge, and Finger Guns. You may think, but isn't Finger Guns the final fire spell? Shouldn't that one actually be really good? Trust me, I know. We'll get into that. We also need to look at our Joker setup. For this run, and every run after, I chose to run Battle Mage, West Wizard, Extra Jump, and Disgrace. Battle Mage and West Wizard are required picks for a build like this, as they and One Trick Cantrip are the only ways to universally lower spell cooldowns without using weapons. Battle Mage lowers spell cooldowns by 1% per kill, and West Wizard cuts all cooldowns by 30% at the cost of 30% of your HP. As for our other Jokers, Extra Jump is sort of a filler slot. You could run literally anything else here and it wouldn't matter. I could have ran something like Life Pack for practically infinite healing or one of elemental cooldown Jokers, but I chose to take Extra Jump instead since it was the most inoffensive pick I could have possibly taken. Plus, it's a nice bit of extra mobility. Finally, I took Disgrace for that sweet 30% movement bonus. This unfortunately means my horse doesn't want to be friends anymore, but who needs a horse when I can simply become the horse? And finally, as for our guns, I just equipped the quad and the revolver since I didn't plan on using either of my weapons yet. With the loadout down and out of the way though, I was ready to start out on normal. I chose to play a payload mission against the Cryptic Necromancer. Payload is a game mode that I'm not really a big fan of on Nightmare, so I figured I would play it early so that I could have a bit more mission variety while I was saving my favorites for later. Dropping into the Far West, I immediately took to testing out Finger Guns, since this is a spell I hadn't actually used before this mission. I whiffed my bubble on a camp and decided that this would be a good time to test Finger Gun's camp clearing ability, and it was alright. It has roughly the same explosive power as a fireball, so it takes a few shots to fully destroy larger camps, but I can see it one-tapping the water towers at least. Moving forward towards the one and only side objective I took this mission, I decided to test out Surcharge in this danger zone, since you would think that burning all enemies in a wide zone would be a great crowd clearing ability. I didn't get a great look at the damage on my first use, but I heard things dying, so I figured it was probably doing a pretty solid job. Things were still very much alive though, so I pulled Finger Guns to clear the horde. After everything was clear, I blinked a bunch of batteries together for a fat stack of cash and started heading towards the main objective. Payload is one of the objectives in the video game for sure. There's nothing I like more in my games than sitting on an objective and just waiting. Now, I do think there are ways to make Payload a little more enjoyable. I think the push area around the payload should be a little bit wider, so you actually have some room to move around the payload instead of just being forced to hug it the entire time. I also think that while it is really funny, the cart probably shouldn't insta-kill enemies it runs over. Until you get up to like Nightmare, the cart kind of just kills everything that comes in front of it, and so the cart never really gets contested and doesn't ever stop for longer than a half a second. Since most enemies are a little too slow to catch up to the cart, you can kind of just AFK on top for most of the trek. Enemies like the bombers can hit you and push you off the top, but sometimes they kind of just whiff everything, especially on lower difficulties when there's only a couple of them around. One paragraph of complaining later though, and we are at the objective. For this first mission, I chose the Necromancer since while it is my favorite boss, once you scale to later difficulties, it gets to be a little too tanky for most spells to really do anything, and the fight really starts to drag. Plus, I needed a way to make finger guns look like they're really good. Like, look at this. One cast dealing a third of the boss's health, while I am literally intentionally missing to place fire on the ground for later. It looks pretty damn good! Now, you may be thinking, why bother putting fire on the ground? Last I checked, boss is there and fire is here, so what's up with that? This is where Bubble finally comes into play, because aside from being an excellent camp clearer that you will be seeing more of later, Bubble can also be placed in fire puddles to spawn fire tornadoes. Are they actually good for boss damage? Not at all, but at least they do a nice bit of area damage and ignite enemies for Surcharge to finally get to do something. Plus, with all of our cooldown reduction, we can basically infinitely cycle tornadoes using the fires left behind after the tornadoes fade, meaning if we're careful, we won't even need to spend finger guns prepping for more, and we can use it to kill the boss just a tad bit quicker. After around 3 minutes, I killed the Necromancer on my third finger gun cycle and headed off for extraction. Unfortunately, for one reason or another, spells are completely unable to activate extraction by hitting the bell. They can hit the bell. I've heard the bell ring after casting spells into it before, but it just doesn't start extraction the way that shooting or punching it would. Overall, this first spell set was okay. I've been alluding to it for a while, but finger guns might be the worst capstone spell in the game. Its damage is fine, but for a 120-second cooldown at base, it just isn't even remotely worth it. It also doesn't help that doing literally anything cancels the spell, meaning if you need to heal or want to cast other spells for combos, you pretty much have to wait until the cast ends or else you are wasting precious DPS. If I could make some changes to make finger guns more viable, I would make it a toggleable spell. I think you should be able to recast it to end it early, refunding part of the cooldown. I also think that it shouldn't be fully interrupted by other spellcasts and actions like drinking from healing bottles, since that just completely kills any chance of it being usable on higher difficulties. This also unfortunately meant that Surcharge kind of didn't get to do, well, anything. The main draw of Surcharge is that it detonates enemies that are already burning, which sounds really alluring if you have other fire spells or a fire secondary. However, the actual area of effect is much shorter than you would think, and a lot of enemies kinda just die to the fire dot before you cast Surcharge in the first place. If the area was wider or the cooldown was shorter, I could see it being much better, but I think that a minute cooldown for Surcharge in its current state just isn't really worth it. It would have also been easier to use if it didn't cancel finger guns, but that isn't really Surcharge's fault. And finally, Bubble is the only spell in this set that I actually really like. It's great for clearing camps, it's a decent spell to use for clearing out fodder enemies, and it can be used to make tornadoes, which can be nice when clearing out large hordes. All of this on only a 40-second cooldown makes it one of my favorite spells in the game, and as I said earlier, this isn't the last time we're going to be seeing it. Moving into hard mode, I swapped out my previous spell set to pick up Pistolero, Ritual, and Geyser. At a first glance, this is a mildly strange build, but there are some really neat combos we can take advantage of here. For this mission, I chose to run a gas bomb against the Cryptic Saloon. The Saloon, while being the easiest boss in my opinion, has some really funny interactions with a handful of spells that I'd like to show off. Dropping back into the Far West, I couldn't really remember if Geyser was a good camp clearer, so I ran straight for a water tower to test. I was thoroughly disappointed to find out that it does basically nothing, but the tower gave me a second wind to compensate, so I can't really complain too much. This time, I didn't really care to take on any side objectives, so I bolted straight for the site where I could build my gas bomb. This minigame is honestly one of my favorite objectives to play. It isn't really hard by any means, but I like the little memory game to build the bun. It's fun. With more defensive spells like what I have with Pistolero and Geyser, you can sort of set up choke points around the objective to keep too many enemies from getting too close. Setting up Pistolero also lets me finally make good use of Ritual, as it has an incredibly strong synergy with most of the cactus spells. Placing the spell circle on or near placed cacti places additional rituals, meaning you can very easily stack a bunch of them for insanely high burst healing. This combo also works with Doll, but it unfortunately doesn't work with Corruption, meaning you can't just instantly convert every single enemy that's ever lived. Bummer. Either way, I still think this is a really cool combo for Voodoo. After obtaining the bomb though, it was time to head straight to the boss arena to fight the saloon. I thought it would be really funny for the cannons to detonate the bomb for me, but they were taking too long, so I just placed a geyser and started the fight. This use of a cooldown was a little bit inconvenient, as geyser is my main and only source of damage for this fight. Pillar type spells like geyser and fire beam are insanely strong against the saloon. Placing them near the corners lets you kite the saloon's panels into the damaging zones constantly, dealing tons and tons of damage very quickly in a boss fight that kinda drags otherwise. This is especially strong during the beam attack, as the boss constantly turns at a pretty consistent rate, breaking more panels and dealing hella damage. Unfortunately, our pistoleros are just a little bit dumb and don't know how to shoot the panels for even more damage, but they're still nice to keep around for fodder clearing and for ritual healing. After a couple minutes though, the saloon fell and released the saloon spirit, which my pistoleros thankfully were able to target. Overall, this spell set was definitely a lot more fun to use compared to the first. These aren't super strong spells by any means, but combining them makes for an actually pretty fun defensive playstyle. I can't guarantee this would work on Nightmare, and you would almost definitely want to swap out Geyser for something else, but I can totally see myself running a similar build for fun on higher difficulties in the future. Moving up to very hard, remember when I told you about fire tornadoes earlier? Yeah, we're going back to those. For this build, I chose to run Fireball, Bubble, and Swap. Fireball and Bubble used to actually be my go-to loadout, with a third spell like Drain, Ritual, or Boing depending on the situation. Fireball has a pretty short cooldown and can take out smaller camps, and is also a solid enough way to place puddles for Bubble to spawn tornadoes from. Swap, though, is a completely new spell to me. I had plenty of people recommend it to me as a Deadeye killer in the comments on my melee video, which you should totally go watch after this if you haven't, and I figured it now would be a great time to test it out. For this mission, I chose to run it back against the Necromancer, this time on a Nitro Cannon mission. This was maybe not the best idea I've ever had, and you'll see why soon. Almost immediately in this mission, a huge problem made itself clear. Spells, in most cases, cannot stun Deadeyes. This was something I had actually already known about, and was something I was really worried would be a big issue for this run. Most spells, for whatever reason, just don't stagger Deadeyes. Drain is seemingly the only spell in my experience that you can consistently use to stun them, but with a 25-second cooldown at base and dealing only 20 damage, it isn't really viable to kill them. Fireball, while it can't stun them, does almost enough damage with the fire dot to kill them pretty quickly. However, it's still pretty common for them to get a shot off before dying. This is where Swap comes into play. Swap lets you switch places with a targeted enemy and causes explosions on both ends of the swap. I can tag a Deadeye with Fireball to deal most of the damage, and then use Swap to confirm the kill before it can get a shot off. Swap can also be great to pull myself out of tight spots and to deal some pretty decent area damage, though there is a slight problem with that. Yeah, Snake's canceling Swap might just be my least favorite thing in the game. I can circumvent this happening by popping a bubble before swapping, but then I'm just killing everything in front of me anyway, so there isn't much of a point. Either way though, I am a really big fan of Swap. Plus, once I made it to the objective and started casting tornadoes, Swap gave me a really good idea. Swapping enemies into my tornadoes is genuinely one of my favorite things to do now. It's just so funny to yoink Deadeyes and Liches directly into their graves. Plus, you barely take any damage from your tornadoes, so this has a much lower risk than you might think it would. Once I figured this out, I just couldn't stop doing it. Literally every chance I had, from the moment I realized I could to the moment I started the fight against the Necromancer. It's just too fun. Unfortunately, this doesn't work against horsemen and bosses, so you can imagine my fear when I entered a danger zone and was unable to swap out of my tornado. After that minor near-death experience though, I cleared the rest of the horde and made my way into the boss arena and started the fight against the Necromancer. Going into this fight, I knew that this was going to be a long one. Remember earlier when I said my tornadoes don't really do good boss damage on normal mode? Yeah, well, that hasn't even remotely changed and has actually gotten so much worse. You would think that I would have prepared for this and packed some better single target spells, but I honestly didn't think it would be that big of a deal. When I played melee only, it took me 6.5 minutes to kill Necromancer on Nightmare. It took 6 whole minutes to get the Necromancer to just half health with tornadoes on very hard. At this point, I decided that I actually wasn't going to sit here for another 6 minutes as all of my healing options dwindled, and I started using my guns. Now, my quad and revolver builds are both pretty bare bones, so this fight still took another 2.5 minutes to clear, but I would have been stuck for so much longer without them. For the bit, I finished off the boss with a swap explosion and wrapped this run up without further issue. So tornadoes, despite how cool they look and how well they can handle hordes, are absolutely terrible for single target damage. Unfortunately, Fireball and Bubble on their own aren't much better for single target either. Fireball does a clean 60 damage and has a pretty short cooldown, but it doesn't have enough burst potential to really be viable for bosses. Bubble does even less damage and with a longer cooldown, so it was out of the picture as well. Spells like Pistolero and Bandito, while they still don't do a ton of damage and might have issues with targeting, would at least be a little more consistent and would maybe fare better, though I would have to test them out to see. Regardless though, I still cleared Extraction and had just one difficulty left. Up until now, I've been mostly just screwing around with different spells to see if they have a niche, but now it's time to get real. For this final run, I chose to play with Bubble, Swap, and Rain. You've seen Bubble and Swap, and despite their pretty clear flaws, they are two of my favorite spells in the game. Rain, though, is a little bit different. Rain is possibly one of the best, if not the best spells in the game. Casting Rain makes it, well, rain. Rain places a giant acid cloud above you that constantly applies acid DOT to everything below it, dealing tons of damage and clearing fodder enemies incredibly quickly. So it's an AoE chaff clearer, big deal. However, Rain also has the added benefit of slowing affected enemies to a crawl, making it easier to deal with the bulkier, more problematic enemies like bulls, liches, and even horsemen. For this final run, I also chose to pull out all of the stops and to intentionally pick weapons for the first time. This is unfortunately the point of the game where spells by themselves start to fall off really hard, but there are ways with a few of our guns that we can keep them viable as our main source of damage. I chose to take the Long Ranger and the dual revolvers, as they both have unique jokers that are incredibly helpful for a spell-based build to carry. The LR gets Focus Shot, which lowers all cooldowns by a full second with each kill. Battle Mage was already strong, but Focus Shot is even better. Paired with the LR's really high pierce, I can kind of just shoot into crowds and pull huge chunks off of my cooldowns. The LR is also a great pick for clearing out Deadeyes, as with a proper speedster build, you can easily one-shot them with a body shot. Finally, the dual revolvers get Swamp Trick, which places elemental puddles with the explosions from reloading your secondary. These puddles are completely functional with her spell combos, and so I chose to run Fire as my secondary element so that I could use my revolvers and Bubble to place tornadoes. I know I was just ragging on Bubble and tornadoes a minute ago, but they are still completely viable under normal circumstances. I think tornadoes are actually perfectly fine to run as long as you use either bow or dual revolvers to place them, as this saves a spell slot for more valuable spells than something like Fireball. I chose to use this extra slot to once again take Swap, because it's a great escape and mobility tool. With everything finally in place, I started my final run on a drill machine mission against the Saloon, and for this mission, I decided that I was going to clear everything. Every side objective, every danger zone, and even the map quest have to be completed before I can take on the boss and extract. Getting into the mission, having my guns accessible to me again is obviously very nice since I no longer need to waste spell cooldowns on taking out small groups and cannons. I honestly think that across the previous 3 runs, I've maybe taken out 2 cannons in total. It just wasn't worth it for me to spend spells on them when I could be spending those spells for clearing other, more immediately dangerous enemies. I chose to clear the drill machine first so I could have the main objective out of the way. I really like this objective. I think it's really fun to try and manage the valve pressure while running laps around the center to keep everything in the green. It isn't too punishing, but it also isn't too easy, unlike something like Cryptic Totem. It's a perfect middle ground. After knocking that out though, I still had to do everything else. Pretty much everything I had to do was located in the bottom half of the map, so I took to clearing all of that out before returning to the top half to clear one last danger zone and the map quest before the boss. My side objectives for this one were pretty easy, but they did take a little bit to complete. Linking batteries takes basically no time at all, since you can connect them through the fences. My other 2 objectives were a bit more time consuming though. The gold mining mission feels pretty slow sometimes, and it only gets slower considering the fact I am just a little bit silly and have a really bad tendency to over or undershoot with my adjustments, so I end up having to take a little bit longer than necessary to move the magnet where it needs to be. My final side objective was even worse, being the stupid ass pumpkins that I hate. I don't think I get this side objective. Maybe there's some method to clearing the patch I just don't get, but I feel like I spend so much time moving between the pumpkins in the latter half of the objective rather than actually breaking them. Between the side objectives, the danger zones, which oddly enough only had a single horseman across the entire stage, and the map quest though, it took me nearly 30 minutes to clear all of the side content before finally reaching the boss. Could that be chalked up to me playing solely? 100%, but that doesn't matter now as we finally get to start the fight against the saloon. You remember when we used Geyser to kill the saloon earlier? Well, we can do it even better with tornadoes. This is the reason I brought Bubble again. Not only are tornadoes wider and able to hit more panels at once, but they also reach high enough to always be able to hit the saloon no matter what phase it's in. Their movement can also help them reach new panels faster, although it usually doesn't make for too much of a damage increase. Unfortunately, the enemy volume was a bit too low for me to have 100% tornado uptime, but regardless, this was still by far the fastest boss encounter I've had out of every single run we've looked at today. The Saloon Spirit died without much issue, and Extraction was opened up for me. The train came and went, and I successfully beat Nightmare with mostly spell damage. So how did I do? Across all 4 runs, I used 9 spells across my winning runs, as well as a handful of others which unfortunately didn't make the cut for this video, but I'll put them up on screen for you all to see. Nightmare took me a few days to get a good build down, but once I had it, I was able to knock out all 4 runs in just a couple of hours of playtime. I had a ton of fun with this build, and I would love to revisit this in the future once we see new spells added. I also hope that some of our existing spells get to see some balance passes or even reworks in the future, since I think that there are several that could really use some changes. Anyways though, that's going to be it from me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching.